So good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this James Cooper Creston Charities webinar on 10 big issues for charities. It's sunny where we are and hopefully it's sunny where you are too. My name's Mike Farwell, I'm the Head of Charities and Education at James Cooper Creston, and I'm joined today by Andrew Smarden, who's a manager in our specialist team. So we've got a good turnout of people listening in on the webinar, a variety of trustees, charity staff and a number of other people interested in charities. In terms of the structure for our session, hopefully you've got some slides in front of you there which list the 10 topics that we'll be covering. We work with around 200 different charities in this rapidly changing world. They're all faced with different challenges, but there are some key themes that we see coming through the work that we do, and we focused on these in presenting this webinar. It will be very much a whistle-stop tour. We'll be spending only 2 or 3 minutes on each topic. The plan is that the webinar will run for approximately half an hour. In terms of your purpose for attending the webinar, I suppose there are 2 potential outcomes. One is that this will all be brand new to you and you'll be delighted to find all this out and to consider how it links back to your own charity. Or the second is that you'll be delighted that you knew all this already and had everything in hand. And of course there may well be a number of people on the sort of spectrum in between the two. In terms of questions, you have the ability to ask questions on the screen and we'll deal with this at the end. So we will now run through. So the first topic is reserves. This has been very topical recently. It's of course a requirement of the Charity Commission for charities to consider reserves, but more importantly it's critical in terms of the sustainability and resilience of your charity. Historically the argument has often been framed whether charities have too much or not enough reserves. I think in recent times, as financial challenges have impacted on charities, the whole sustainability agenda and having enough reserves to continue has been very important. For those charities fortunate enough to have built up more significant levels of reserves, it's a question of considering beneficiary need, and we have seen a number of charities using the reserves in the last few years to meet increased beneficiary need, although probably less than we had actually expected. Cash flow is of course critical, and Andrew will cover financial management a bit later. In terms of the reserves policy, which you're required to have, which we'll come on to shortly, the policy should not be tailored to existing reserves levels. So we have seen some charities, perhaps those with substantial levels of reserves, let's say they had 2 years of operating costs and reserves, and they therefore framed their policy to be around having a requirement for 2 years reserves. Of course that may not necessarily be the case. In terms of managing financial difficulties, the Charity Commission has issued some useful guidance on this topic in terms of charity responsibilities in recent times. So in terms of the Charity Commission guidance, this is relatively recent. The guidance covers what reserves are, the importance of having a reserves policy, the requirements for publication and reporting of reserves policy. So perhaps the most obvious of that is a requirement to include something in your annual accounts about what your policy is and how you're performing against it. It's vital to keep an oversight of reserves. Again, with the changes in the financial situation, the economy, etc., things can change quite rapidly. So this is not something that you can look at every few years. It needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. Reserves, of course, the Charity Commission guidance indicates, and I think we would all know this, very important in maintaining your activities. Perhaps not for the first time in this webinar, we'll mention the Kids Company, which is a reasonably large charity that collapsed, and one of the reasons was it didn't really have sufficient reserves. Contrary to popular opinion, the Charity Commission guidance doesn't say what level of reserves charities should have. It needs to be tailored to this specific charity. In terms of charities with functional assets, so for example school buildings, it may well be that the charity on the face of it has a very high level of reserves, but the reality is that they're all tied up in property and therefore not freely available. And the final point in this section is the question of pension scheme deficits. If you are an employee of charity and you're in a final salary pension scheme, you may well be delighted, although of course the reality is that these can potentially have a very big impact on charity accounts in terms of deficits, and we'll touch upon pension schemes a little bit later. So vital to consider what your reserves are and to take appropriate action. we move on to trustee skills and experience, I think many charities will know that it is a challenge sometimes to find trustees, and perhaps not just generally trustees, but trustees with the skills that you need. In terms of the discussions that you have with potential trustees, evidence suggests and surveys suggest that 90% of people enjoy being a trustee and 75% acquire new skills. So it can be very positive for an individual to become a charity trustee. Some, of course, are worried about responsibilities, and it is important to make clear what these responsibilities are, but without over-focusing on the responsibilities, there needs to be some consideration about what the benefits are. Many charities, and particularly larger ones, are having more formal skills audit these days, and we'll see in a moment some of the skills that you might look for on your board. In terms of recruitment, historically networks have been very important for recruiting new trustees. I think these days people will often use advertising and other more formal means to identify the right people and carry out interviews, and perhaps in a manner similar to the way that you would look to recruit an employee. Induction is an important element of somebody becoming a trustee, so they should obviously meet with the relevant people, management and trustees of the charity, receive appropriate induction relating to the specific charity and also about their general responsibilities. It's perhaps worth mentioning that there's some useful Charity Commission guidance on this. I think probably the Essential Trustee is the most useful of these. And there is also a need, once the induction is over, that isn't it. Looking at giving training to charities, this is something that we often deal with ourselves, and many charities now are going into more formal appraisals of trustees. Of course, these need to be handled very, very carefully, as the trustees are, of course, volunteers, but it can be a useful way of making sure that you get the most from the trustees in your charity. In terms of the perfect world of trustee skills, this is a list here of the skills that you might have. I think it's probably fair to say there are few or possibly no charities in the whole of the UK with the perfect mix of trustee skills. I won't go through all these in detail, but perhaps three just worthy of mention. Organisational development and change. Of course, we live in rapidly changing times, and charities are affected by this just as other organisations, so very useful if you have somebody who can help with facilitating that change and the development of the organisation. In terms of fundraising, there have been some changes in regulation in recent times, so it's useful if you've got somebody on board who understands these. And there is, of course, the whole topic of actually raising funds themselves rather than just the regulation that surrounds them. And then finally, Andrew will cover this a bit later, but the technology and the rapid pace of change, always useful to have someone on board who understands technology. I think the average age of trustees in the UK at the moment is 57, so I think if you recruit somebody onto your board who's got technology experience, there's a very good chance that will bring the average age down. So these are some of the trustee skills that you would have in the perfect world. I think it's fair to say also that these need to be balanced with the skills that you may have in your organisation in terms of the management, and particularly in smaller charities it may well be that the employees have some skills, trustees have other skills, and these combined together can be used to best benefit. We move on to diversifying income. Over the last, I suppose, 8 years, there's certainly been challenges in terms of the economic climate and the whole sustainability agenda of charities, and if you are able to diversify, this will help finance your charitable activities and perhaps keep the charity going if some of your more traditional sources of financing have dried up. So in terms of the areas that you might look to diversify, certainly in terms of your charitable operations, that may well be one. We're seeing a lot of charities put a lot of effort into fundraising at the moment, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But of course you can also branch out into commercial activities which are not charity related, and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a minute. Always important to consider the risks of any new activity, particularly in the commercial arena. And I think it's fair to say, in terms of achieving additional income, we do see charities who have great plans to generate and diversify income into the future, but don't invest in the resources to actually achieve that. So be realistic about what you can achieve, and if you need to invest, consider doing that. Innovation is great in terms of novel ideas, etc. again, a rapidly changing world, one needs to think a bit differently if one can. And we've also seen a number of charities widening their charitable objects so that they're able to carry out additional activities under the charitable umbrella. In terms of commercial opportunities, charities with significant facilities, for example schools, can use their property. We're seeing more charities doing joint ventures with commercial organisations. There is some guidance from the Charity Commission on that. I think there was some controversy around, for example, the age concern and energy deals, so watch out for who you're getting involved with. Increased collaboration with other people. It may well be that your charity expertise can be used in a slightly different way, so it may well be that you can provide some training outside your traditional activities. Having some commercial expertise on your board is of course very useful. And in any commercial activity, it's a question of considering the risks, the structure and the legal. So it may well be that you would carry out activities within a trading subsidiary, which is also useful for tax purposes. Financing of these activities can of course be a challenge because the Charity Commission is not keen on charitable monies being used to finance commercial activities. And of course the level of control, particularly in joint ventures, is important. In terms of increased salary costs, I mean, at a time when income is under pressure, costs have been increasing too. In the south of England, recruitment is a challenge, unemployment is low. We will like to see some inflationary pressures into 2017, which may impact on salary costs. We have had some national insurance increases this year. Over the next few years, we've got the impact of the national living wage, which will impact on charities with lower paid employees, and as well as the individuals at these rates, the £9 an hour target by 2020. This may impact in terms of salary differentials by people who are earning slightly above these amounts. There's also the impact of pension schemes and the new pension arrangements under auto-enrolment, which we'll cover in a moment. So if we look at sort of pension costs, those of you, and we've got a number of schools on the call involved with local government pension schemes, will know significant deficits in recent years, increased contributions. Of course, the good news is that these are partly due to the fact that people are living longer, but low interest rates are also having an impact. Teachers' pension scheme costs are likely to increase significantly in the next few years. And for all organisations, is the question of pensions auto-enrolment, making sure that you have an appropriate pension scheme if you don't have one already. The rules are relatively complex. I suppose in simple terms it's fair to say 3% employer contribution is likely to be in place by April 2019, and you need to make sure that you invest appropriate time and energy in dealing with the pensions. This is an area where change is ever present, so there may well be further changes on the way. Right, if we move on to Brexit, it would be inappropriate these days ever to carry out a presentation, of course, without mentioning Brexit, and the same goes for charity sector. Many charities are now including it on the risk register, not that they're necessarily clear exactly what the risk is, but they're conscious that there may be some risk. I think we all know there's a great deal of uncertainty. There may be an impact on public sector funding in terms of austerity. There's a likely impact on investment returns into the future, possible impact on charitable giving. Recruitment, I think, is likely to be an issue, particularly for those charities that rely on overseas workers. Exchange rate movements may have an impact if you have expenditure or income in foreign currencies. Of course, there's also some concern in some sectors about reductions in EU funding, which is often important for charities. And of course, against all this, hard economic times, if that is indeed what happens as a result of Brexit, generally leads to greater beneficiary needs. So we're going to run a poll now. So on your screen, you'll see the question, how do you think Brexit will impact your charity? And you'll see there are 4 options there: favourably, unfavourably, no impact, or not sure. So we can give that some thought over the next few seconds and put your vote through. So we've got a number of votes coming in. Just a few more seconds for any final votes. So that's quite interesting. I think 50%, around about 50% of people are saying that there'll be no impact of Brexit, and then there's a balance between unfavourably and not sure. Interesting to see that nobody feels that Brexit will favourably impact on their charity. So with that dramatic news, I'll now hand over to Andrew, who's going to cover the big issues 6 to 10. Andrew.
Good afternoon. It's with just half an hour. Any one of these issues could cover an entire webinar on its own, so we will run through quickly. With potentially tougher times ahead and increasing numbers of the activities that government has provided in the past, we are likely to see, I think, an increasing number of charities taking on areas they haven't done before, and also wondering whether they will be stronger together. So we feel that mergers and collaboration may become a more common thing in future years. There's currently just over 165,000 charities registered with the Charity Commission, and we know there are many more great local charities who fall below the charity registration thresholds besides that. The Charity Commission are encouraging trustees to keep it under regular review as to whether a merger might be in the best interest of the charity and its beneficiaries. There are all kinds of ways that a merger or collaborative working could actually improve what a charity does, whether it's more effective use of resources, joining together to have a single louder voice within the community and with government, whether a more coherent and joined up approach would work between a group of charities, better ability to develop strategy or to apply for grant funding, and often commonly reducing duplication and fragmentation of services across an area. It's not a process which should be undertaken lightly, however, and there are all kinds of issues in terms of considering the compatibility of the merging charities and consulting with beneficiaries and members which need to be gone through before you begin the process. It's often quite costly as well, and there are all kinds of costs in terms of merging your IT systems, rebranding, communicating the decision you've made to your beneficiaries and the community at large, which need to be considered. Which is why I think the financial and legal considerations are really important in terms of taking on a merger. You should have a really clear memo of understanding between the charities, setting out your common objectives, the plan you have for the merger in some detail, a good robust timetable, an idea of how you'll share the costs, how you're going to communicate the rebranding and the merger to interested beneficiaries and the community at large. And in some ways, most importantly, agreeing confidentiality, which is particularly important if the merger doesn't go through. Undertaking a really strong due diligence process with the help of accountants and lawyers is, I think, essential for any merger. There are all kinds of employment issues and legal issues which you need to consider. Many charities will have restricted funds, and it's important to make sure that these can be properly preserved within a kind of merged charity. You may even have issues around things like special trusts and endowment. The planning process and the communication, as I've mentioned, is really, really important. It's something which takes up an immense amount of staff time, and often it's people like the chief executive and the key management team who have really important day-to-day duties that they will be drawn away from in the merger. So again, going that clear project plan, good oversight and getting guidance from the trustees through the process will really help you mitigate your risks and hopefully progress to some kind of successful merger. That said, merger isn't for everyone. And one thing that Mike and I see with an increasing number of charities is collaborative working. We deal with a homelessness charity, for example, which has a very good partnership with a local employment charity. So having got people, enable people to unpick some of their difficulties and their problems, move them towards autonomous living, they then help them find opportunities for employment to continue with their lives. And often there is an argument as well for a local focus, nimble charities who understand their community and have a good connection to local volunteers. In those cases, the merger isn't necessarily something which will be suitable for you. To move on to public confidence in charities, the Charity Commission issued a slightly depressing report over the summer they commissioned from a firm called Populous, talking about the key drivers of trust in charities and how the public feel about the sector compared to a couple of years ago. So those key drivers revolve around the use of donations, and whether the public feel they make it to the end cause, whether the charity is well managed. And I think due to a lot of the mixture of fair and unfair stories in the media recently, there was a particular concentration on whether the way in which charities fundraise is honest and ethical. What the report showed is the overall level of trust and confidence in charities has fallen considerably on the levels from 2012 and 2014, and clearly things like the Age UK Aon mis-selling scandal that Mike mentioned earlier and the collapse of Kids Company have had a bit of an impact on the way the public perceives charities. A way I think that charities can guard against that is through a better use of things like the Trustees Report. The Charity Commission tried to address that within the new SORT by moving the achievements and performance to the start of the report, so you really get into the difference you're making to the community, and also in some of the sort of more the specific disclosures, such as addressing areas about the remuneration of key management personnel. responding perhaps to some of the Daily Mail stories about sort of chief executive pay within charities. Overall, it's really important to say that it's no longer enough that charities simply do good. They must be seen to do good as well. And we might touch on that a little bit when we talk about technology and social media later. But I think being able to communicate the difference you make to your beneficiaries and helping the public understand what you do is essential. One thing the Populous report did show is that where people feel they have a personal connection or awareness of the charity's work, they're much more likely to trust it. Moving on quickly to charity strategy and scenario planning. We talked before with the mergers and also with reserves policy about having really robust planning in place. And I think it's essential that every charity has some form of formal strategy document which sets out its mission, vision and values, enables it to then feed that down to the staff, the trustees, the management personnel and the people doing delivering the key work to beneficiaries, all understand the charity's goals and how you intend to get to them, giving you an opportunity to see what the strengths, weaknesses, the opportunities and threats the charity face, and really bring in investment and commitment from the whole team into getting towards those objectives. It also enables the charity to prioritise spending on key activities, thinking again about those issues of resilience and reserves policy that Mike raised earlier. And a very helpful way of thinking about charity strategy is actually to do some scenario planning, to take 2 or 3 different sort of potential scenarios in the future and work them through as a group, taking in some of the key staff of the charity, maybe using some volunteers, some of the employees, to kind of think, to simulate and think about what the key drivers of change the charity faces in future years are. I worked, for example, once with a charity which hadn't thought through legislative change's impact on the work it did. It provided legal advisory work to people with housing difficulties. And because they didn't foresee the legal changes, because they didn't think about ways they could collaborate with other charities to close funding gaps and to sort of provide different kinds of advice, that charity unfortunately went into liquidation. And I think actually looking forward, thinking about potential threats and having a more sustainable vision might have helped them survive. Strategy ties in very strongly to financial management. I think it's an area that we could talk about at some length, but something which is very much in my mind at the moment, dealing with academy schools at the moment, is the way in which a charity needs to be both resilient, to have a good level of free reserves, and also to be accountable. In these tougher times, many charities will find there is a ceiling on the level of income they can bring in, particularly from government sources, and that makes good cost control and a good explanation to your beneficiaries and to the public at large as to what you're doing particularly important. Always thinking about, in a more commercial way, about value for money and what you offer people is, I think, really helpful. I think those charities who we see doing most well, particularly with the schools at the moment, the ones who build up their free reserves, are the ones who have really good formal procedures, where there's a really good understanding of what the trustees and the staff are doing, good control over expenditure, systems and controls which enable them to maintain the security of their assets, and most importantly, good medium-term budgeting. You can't just think of the year ahead in today's environment. So moving on to technology and social media, I think our colleagues would probably agree it's not necessarily an area they would come to Mike and myself for advice upon, but it is something which is going to be more and more important for charities in the future. It's a great fundraising tool. I think having a really vibrant, engaged community on social media is a great way of attracting volunteers, a great way of attracting donors. Going back again to the issue of public trust, I think it's also a great way of communicating with people and maintaining a kind of positive drip feed, transparent, good stories about how you're delivering your service to your beneficiaries in an effective way. It's also something which is a great way to deliver services. I deal with a charity at the moment who, again, Mike mentioning the youth aspect of dealing with IT, they offer a web portal for young people which is secure, has a sort of, from a safeguarding point of view, is stable for to be able to get in, but it gives them not just entertainment and sort of and information, but it's also one which provides a portal for them to get to career development opportunities in a way that provides access to people who wouldn't normally have it, and with a very kind of cost-effective way through doing it on the internet. We also see increasing amounts of beneficiary support, medical charities using apps in order to communicate with patients. Mike and I deal with a fantastic charity which has a web-based series of videos about people dealing with life-threatening or life-limiting illnesses. And their thought about how they deliver their services has changed in recent years. It's not such a passive people sitting at a desktop. One of their, what seemed like a small but actually a really important innovation for them was finding some budget in order to convert their website for mobile phone use. That's where most people get their information nowadays. And it has really expanded their reach in an unexpected way. Moving to a more mundane fashion, something Mike and I see a lot more with our clients is increasing use of the cloud for accountancy software. Many of the charities we deal with will use a package like Sage, which is robust and reliable, but dates back to the kind of the pre-internet age, and so isn't as flexible as some of the more cloud-based solutions you see now. They provide solutions for data storage issues, they provide some resilience in terms of things crashing and failing within your own office, but also I think most importantly they enable staff and trustees to log in and get access to financial information from wherever they are, and provides a degree of flexibility of working that I think is very valuable. The internet also provides threats. Obviously, a good example is adoption charities who over many years did great detective work, built relationships with local authorities, and developed databases of great confidential information to help people find their birth parents. The internet has changed all that. People aren't willing to pay for services anymore. It has reduced the funding available for these adoption charities, but it also means that people are sometimes not getting the kind of measured, careful introduction to their birth parents they may have done in the past. So that's a very quick run through, and I'll pass you back to Mike.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So as Andrew said, very much a whistle-stop tour of some key issues, so hopefully you picked up some useful tips to take back to your charity to have a look at. You'll see the contact details for Andrew and myself there. If anybody wants to give us a ring or drop us an email, we're very happy to deal with it. We've had a couple of questions that have come through. One is, you haven't mentioned accounting changes. Aren't these important? Of course, it would be rather remiss of an accountant to say that accounting changes aren't important. I think the reality is the recent changes to the charity accounting rules have been evolutionary rather than revolutionary. We've dealt with the transition for many of our clients in the last 12 months. I think it's fair to say that in many cases the changes have not been that significant. I think many charities are feel that it's something that they've dealt with and are moving on. Of course, the bad news is that the charity accounting rules didn't change for 10 years, but we're already on a review process underway of the changes in the 2015 accounting rules, so expect to see some further changes in 2019. But let's hope in a world that's constantly changing that these are not dramatic, and we have the opportunity to try and catch up and get used to the new rules before we see some new ones. We've also had another question, have many charities emerged in the last few years? Andrew, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I think we see in the charity press every now and again that this year is going to be the year of the merger, and I don't think that is necessarily that we're going to see a sudden sort of glut of them, but I think we will see more. And I think the issues around, we dealt with one recently which actually didn't go through because in terms of two charities involved, there was a major funder who needed to be consulted. It became very rapidly apparent that the funder felt one charity had rather better systems and controls, rather better idea of strategy than the other, and they really wouldn't be prepared to support a merged charity, and the merger fell through.
And I think it's probably fair to say that over the last 8 years, certainly from 2008 onwards, there was a lot of speculation that there's around about 160,000 charities in the UK that the number would drop significantly. I think the evidence is the number hasn't really changed that dramatically, and in many cases charity mergers have only really taken place as a measure of last resort. Many charities, fiercely independent and want to carry on the work they do themselves rather than considering merging with another one. So I think pretty much that's it. I think we're just under half an hour that hopefully you've allotted for the seminar. Thank you very much for tuning in, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.